I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the sad passing of a fixture in the Democratic Party and American politics, as Frank Lautenberg, the 5-term Democratic senator from New Jersey, passed away early Monday morning at the age of 89. Frank Lautenberg was born to poor Jewish immigrant parents from Russia and Poland. After graduating high school, he joined the Army Signal Corps and served in Europe during World War II. Frank Lautenberg was the last remaining World War II veteran serving in the United States Senate. There are none now. Since Lautenberg's youth, he pursued the American dream, and along with 2 of his childhood buddies, started the world's first payroll service company, Automatic Data Processing. After achieving significant success in that business, Lautenberg looked to give back to the country that had given him so much, which is why he ran for the Senate, and ultimately had a most productive and illustrious career in that body. Lautenberg fought for the passage of legislation relating to gun control, tobacco regulation, transportation, the environment, among other issues. One of his most influential works was the Lautenberg Amendment, which permitted Jews from the former Soviet Union to gain refugee status, a law which ultimately extended to anyone seeking asylum in the United States as a result of religious persecution. And Frank Lautenberg was a Jew. He was a Jewish United States Senator with a passion for the Jewish people and the State of Israel. And during the 1970s, he was the president of the UJA. But how did Frank Lautenberg's colleagues view him? And what will his enduring legacy be? For some insight, we're so pleased to be joined yet again on our phones from Washington, the Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, Ron Kampeas. Ron, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Ron, did you know Frank at all on a one-to-one basis?
Only to interview him every now and then, whether it was, I guess, mostly about immigration issues, because that was his signature law. Although
yes,
he actually authored a lot of successful legislation, but like you said, his signature law was the Lautenberg Amendment, which effectively made it much easier for literally hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews to come to the United States right before the fall of the former Soviet Union.
What was the dynamic between the two of you?
You know, there are some lawmakers who, they just want to get their talking points out, and there are other lawmakers who really listen to you, who interact, and you can see that they do the same thing, or they probably do the same thing with their constituents, and it's what makes them popular. I mean, in that sense, he was definitely the latter. He listened to you. He wasn't talking points. He wanted to make sure that you were heard, that he understood what you were trying to say.
And how do you feel he was regarded by his colleagues? What was his reputation, if you have any sense of it? What was his reputation in the Senate?
He was admired. I mean, I think one of the significant things we saw today was that within minutes we got an obituary email from the National Jewish Democratic Council and then the Republican Jewish Coalition. He was admired across the board. He was a guy who pursued. He was very liberal, but he pursued unpopular, sometimes unpopular legislation without qualms. He didn't care what people thought in terms of the Washington conventional wisdom. He cared about what his constituents thought.
Can you give me any example of the way you felt he took a courageous stand at any point during his career while you were covering him?
Sure. I mean, the Lautenberg Amendment, for instance, this was a very difficult year for Republicans and Democrats in the Senate in terms of getting along. There's very little they could agree on. One of the areas where they could find some common ground was on immigration reform, because that's an issue that unites the parties, that people really want to get it done. There's a clamoring for it from both sides of the aisle. And Lautenberg made sure that he got his amendment permanently ensconced in the law. It actually passed out of committee. We don't know if it's going to passed yet, but the odds are that it's going to pass. But he dedicated, his final months to making sure that his amendment was being made permanent. Because what happened previously is that the way it was passed in 1989 is that it had to be approved each year in the Senate, the financing bills, the appropriations bills. And so what's going to happen now, if this is true, is that it'll be up to the discretion of the president, whoever the president is, and he won't have to go back to Congress every year asking for authorization.
Mm-hmm.
I think, the two great significant issues for him were social justice, what he perceived to be social justice, and his Jewishness. I mean, this is a guy who was involved in the Soviet Jewry movement before he became a candidate.
That's right.
He got involved in the Jewish community. He got involved in the Soviet Jewry community. He headed the UJA in the 1970s. He actually turned it around in a very difficult decade. There was a big recession going on then, but he actually managed to raise the income. And then he was this neophyte who ran for the Senate in 1982, actually at a time when Democrats were doing very well, weren't doing very well in New Jersey. And he won. And in his campaign in the Jewish community, he basically said, I'm not going to forget Jewish issues when I get into the Senate. And he made good on that. Soviet Jewry was a huge issue for him. And so what had happened is that one of the difficulties in getting Jews out of the Soviet Union was that to give anybody refugee status in the United States, you actually have to prove still that either your life is at risk or your liberty is at risk, that you're at risk of imprisonment. And of course, there was the Soviet Jews were suffering, but not all of them. In fact, the vast majority of them were not at risk necessarily of imprisonment. But so he created the Lautenberg Amendment, which made it, which allowed a condition applying to certain countries where if you were in a religious minority that could prove that you were being persecuted, perhaps not to the extent of your life being threatened, but you were being persecuted in that you were denied housing, you were denied jobs, you were denied entrances into universities, that would qualify you for immigration. And that, there was literally 200, 300,000 Soviet Jews who got out because of that. And
yes.
he was attached to that idea because of where his parents came from.
How about Israel?
He was a pro-Israel stalwart. One of the first things he did as soon as he retired from the Senate for the first time in 2001 was organize a trip to Israel. He'd paid for the foundation of an institute studying cancer and immunology at Hebrew University because his father had died of cancer in 1968, and there was a park named, he was a very wealthy man. There was a park named after him in Rishon LeZion. So one of the first things he wanted to do was get to Israel and see things on the ground in a way that you don't often have the luxury of doing when you're a politician. So he had that attachment. One thing he was outspoken on regarding Israel was religious pluralism. He really felt that Israel needed to open up marriage to non-Orthodox rabbis, to establish precepts that would allow for civil marriage.
Mm-hmm. In general, by the way, was he regarded highly by, for lack of a better phrase, the Jewish establishment? Did Jewish organizations respect Frank Lautenberg as a Jewish senator?
Absolutely. Very, very much so. I mean, his door was open to them. For the Soviet Jewry movement, his door was open to it. For pro-Israel groups, the door was open. For women's Jewish groups, the door was always open. He knew them because he was one of, there are always, let's say, 30 to 40 Jewish members in Congress in both houses, but there are a handful of them that have actually had experience as either lay or professional leaders in the Jewish community. And he was one of them. He had been president of the UJA in the 1970s. So you walked in and you could say you were a member of whatever Jewish organization, large or small, and you would likely get a meeting with the senator, not just his staff. So he was very, very much admired, and he championed their issues. He was the Lautenberg Amendment was considered critical. He was a liberal Jewish senator from New Jersey. I don't know if you probably know this, but the Iranian Jewish community here is quite conservative. I don't think there's a community that loved him more because he once the Lautenberg Amendment had done its work for Soviet Jews, he made sure it would facilitate the exit of Iranian Jews from Iran, and not just other minorities in Iran as well, the Zoroasters, the Baha'i. But he was just admired across the board for that reason.
Speak now to a wrinkle of what you've just referred to. He had a particularly Jewish identification. that is not necessarily true of United States senators who happen to be Jewish.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think he did. I mean, he thought it was a very important element of his makeup. And like I said, there were two things. The other point I didn't elaborate on was the social justice issue. He was a poor kid from Paterson. His father died of cancer when he was still a boy, and he blamed the silk mills in Paterson, New Jersey. He really it informed a lot of his legislation in terms of protecting consumers, banning cigarette smoking in public places. He was the guy who effectively banned smoking on airplanes. That was very much a part of. He got into Columbia University because of the GI Bill, and he got his degree in economics. Was able to make something of himself because of it. So he was largely in favor of a role for government in the life of the citizen. But the Jewish part was hugely important to him. One of the most affecting stories I heard today was that when President Reagan went to Bitburg for the 40th anniversary of VE Day, at the end of the World War II. Reagan, I don't know if all your listeners or viewers will remember, went to Bitburg, which is where there are not just Wehrmacht German soldiers buried, but Nazi SS, members of the Nazi SS buried. And there was just a lot of Jewish figures were expressing outrage, were appealing to Reagan not to go. And what Lautenberg is he called a friend who was a Holocaust survivor, a survivor of Dachau in New Jersey. He called a leader of the Jewish community in New Jersey, and they flew to Dachau, and they walked through Dachau the day before the VE Day, and then on the day of VE Day, they flew to Belgium, to Henri La Chapelle, to one of which is one of the biggest American soldiers' cemeteries in Europe, where there are close to 8,000 soldiers buried, and he laid a wreath on 3 tombs, and 3 graves. He carefully chose them. There were 2 were Christian American soldiers, 1 was a Jewish American soldier, and he said, "This is where American leaders needed to be today." And so you see from that, I mean, it was all wrapped up in one for him. His patriotism. He was a soldier. He was a patriot. He really believed that his constituents were first and foremost what he had to consider. And he was a politician who could afford to believe that because he was able to pay for his campaigns. But he also believed that America offered Jewish people a chance, and he was going to protect that chance.
Ron, I did not know that story, and it gave me chills. That's a very wonderful story that Lautenberg is laying a wreath at Dachau while President Reagan is going with Elie Wiesel to Bitburg. It's a fabulous story. All right, Ron, I want to digress for one moment, but I feel it's related in some way, and we'll come back to it. At the moment when you turn on American television, all the networks, it's no longer just Fox or MSNBC. There's a discussion of whether there are scandals going on in Washington, especially as they relate to the Obama administration, the Justice Department, the IRS. I want to ask you quickly, as somebody who is a journalist ensconced in Washington, to what extent, when you hear the discussion of how the Justice Department looked at the phone records of reporters for the Associated Press and the Fox correspondent who happens to be Jewish, Mr. Rosen, at Fox being investigated by the IRS, to what extent are you, as a Jewish journalist, and I now underline journalist, to what extent do you feel this issue is a serious, real issue for America? To what extent do you feel it is being overblown?
I think it's both. It's a serious issue, and the thing is, it's been a serious issue. There are people, there are Republicans in Congress who are trying to make it a partisan issue. I've written particularly about the James Rosen case. He was named as a possible co-conspirator when the Justice Department was seeking a subpoena for his email. He was named as a possible co-conspirator under a statute that was used under the Bush administration against 2 former AIPAC staffers, the exact same statute. And it's a statute that was hastily and poorly written. It was sort of written in 2 parts at 2 different times of crisis in United States history. Once first in 1917 during the First World War, and then in 1950 during the most intense period of the Cold War, 1950. And it's not a well-written statute. It's a statute that I would suggest that governments avoid. There have been some of the leading constitutional lawyers have written about this statute in the Espionage Act, saying it's first of all incomprehensible, and second of all, because it's incomprehensible, you could drive a truck through it. You could probably indict anybody using it because it's written in such vague, broad language. And it was used against AIPAC staffers, against lobbyists. Under the Bush administration, it was threatened to be used. I think you can reasonably say that the subpoena seeking James Rosen's emails implied a threat that it would be used against him. And there just seems to be, first of all, within the national intelligence community, within the security community, a kind of a hunger, a lust to use this statute to criminalize the gathering of information. And unfortunately, you get among both Democratic and Republican presidencies a willingness to hear it out in terms of the effort to stamp out leaks. And they've just simply, somebody has to say, okay, we're going to go after leaks, but we are not going to do it this way. We're not going to go after the people who take the leaks, the reporters or the lobbyists. We're going to go after the leakers, and we're going to be very, very careful to protect the rights of the gatherers of information when
Yes.
they do so.
The related issue, of course, is the IRS investigating Tea Party conservative groups. And there are some who've charged, although it seems to me as I look at this more and more, Ron, it's harder to, at the moment, have any evidence to back it up. But there are some who are arguing that pro-Israel groups, especially those who are more on the right, have also been targeted by the IRS. To what extent does that bother you as an issue affecting the current administration?
It also bothers me. I think more in terms, like you said at first, the bigger issue is actually the one that has more substance to it. The singling out of Tea Party groups, of conservative groups for review. It looks now like this is sort of typical, sort of trickle down governance in which some mid-level anonymous staffer in Cincinnati gets the impression that Washington will be pleased if he goes after these conservative groups, and so he does. And that ultimately the fault does lie with the higher ups and not just the anonymous mid-level staffer, because they have to make it clear that that kind of thing is out of bounds and should not be pursued. But regarding the pro-Israel groups, there's the one case that I see covered often is the case of Z Street, which is based in Philadelphia. It's a conservative pro-Israel group. The difference there is that they were seeking 501c3 status. The whole Tea Party IRS scandal has to do with 501c4 status. 501c4 groups are allowed to be more political. They are allowed to, they have a certain, they can't be partisan. They're not allowed to be attached to a party, but they can certainly advocate for issues that might be perceived as political, let's say, for abortion rights or for pro-life groups. And so those groups are allowed to, but the payoff they get is that they do have a certain degree of tax exemption, but it's not as high as for 501c3 groups. 501c3 groups are essentially educational groups. They have much broader tax exemption. It's much more liberal in terms of what they can apply for, but the conditions are much, much more stringent. And so it's not really a surprise that a group like Z Street, which is attached very much to a political issue, the settlement issue in Israel would receive scrutiny. As it happens, this hasn't been reported. Another group that's attached to the Meretz party, left-wing Zionist parties in Israel, Amenu, also underwent a great deal of scrutiny in terms of its pursuit of 501c3 status. I think that there's what's true, I find, at the IRS is that as soon as they see any kind of Middle East, left or right, in the title of a group, there seems to be a trigger there. It's not, the word has gotten down there. Just examine this group a little more closely. It's not so much that it has to do with politics, but I think that there's a hesitation in the IRS to be liberal with groups that are in any way steeped in Middle Eastern politics.
I understand. But we should say that the Zionist Organization of America, ZOA, just did have its tax-exempt status reinstated. And of course, it is at least as conservative, if not more so, than Z Street. So it's hard for me yet to see a larger pattern, although Z Street does say that it was told by an IRS agent on the phone that there was this special group looking into any organization that had the word Israel in it and opposed the administration policies on Middle East peace. I just have not yet seen a secondary story that backs that up. Have you?
No, I haven't seen that at all.
Okay. You used one word I want to clarify with you. You used the word partisan. And I want to know, I am suspicious of the word partisan here. And I'll tell you why, and I want your reaction. I was in professional journalism for a secular radio station, a mainstream radio station, WMCA, a telephone talk station in the early 1970s, one of the first in the country, that did serious editorials almost every day. And I had the privilege of being the editorial director at that time. And I basically was creating the editorial policy with the president of the station, R. Peter Strauss. And at the time, there was a policy that basically we and many others were engaged in where we thought the Nixon administration had gone way beyond the line in all facets of the Watergate issue. I say issue because it really extended to many other ancillary questions as well. But our position was, it wasn't about partisan politics. It wasn't because there were Democrats who were opposed to it, but that Richard Nixon did, using the IRS, the Watergate break-in, the Ellsberg fiasco, everything he was doing, and then refusing to give up the tapes, was basically a violation of trust between the executive and the American people, as well as the executive and the judiciary and the legislature. And for us, it was not a partisan issue. We thought it was a matter of principle. And for me, although I know the Republicans, by the way, are all ganging up on the Obama administration, I still want to be a person of principle. And I want you to be a person of principle. I want every journalist to basically be saying there are certain things which any administration, having nothing to do with their party, should not be permitted to do. And the press, the media, what you do for JTA, and what I do here on Shalom TV, I don't want to ever worry that anything I say or do which may be critical of an administration will bring the IRS down on me or anybody who works for Shalom TV or anybody who works for the JTA or a Jewish person who works for Fox or anybody who works for Fox.
Right.
And for me, I don't want to hear Democrats say, well, it's not important because it's really a partisan issue. For me, it's a matter of principle, and I would hope everybody, Democrat or Republican, has that perspective. And if it so happens that there's a Democrat in the White House, it doesn't make us any less critical than we were when a Republican was in the White House during the early 1970s. And I want to know what your comment is.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that, you know, it's like sometimes it's hard to walk a nuanced middle line in Washington in politics. I think that there's a way to distinguish oneself, let's say, from the partisanship of what Darrell Issa is doing on the Oversight Committee, where he's already assumed that there was White House directives going out on the IRS thing. We have to wait and see, but also to be very wary of an Attorney General like Eric Holder, who, you know, is doing a lot of good work, I'm sure, elsewhere, but who signs off on the subpoena.
Yes.
You know, and looks at and hope presumably he or one of his senior staff reads through it and sees that there's a potential here for indicting a journalist as a co-conspirator under the Espionage Act. That's crazy.
Yes.
And there are other issues as well. I mean, liberals held President Bush's feet to the fire over drone attacks on Americans. It took until the fifth year of the Obama administration to find similar outrage because Obama, you know, not that I think anybody is necessarily mourning at least some of the targets, but that just the idea that Obama or any president could aim a drone missile at an American citizen without checks and balances.
I agree with you. By the way, I don't know what your stand is on Benghazi, but Benghazi bothers me also, only because the story that we were told about this cockamamie video had nothing to do with the reality of it. And all I believe the American people want to hear is, we made a mistake. And maybe it was for political reasons, and maybe it was to help us not lose the election. But the reality is we never should have been told that story, and we shouldn't have been told it by Susan Rice, we shouldn't have been told it by Hillary Clinton, and we should not have been hearing that story from President Obama. And I feel at the moment the American media, and I count you and I count myself as part of it, we have a responsibility to always be challenging authority and trying to make them as honest, as transparent, and as forthright as they can possibly be, regardless of which party occupies the White House at any time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Last question, we come back. What's Frank Lautenberg's long legacy, his enduring legacy? What's it going to be?
Well, first of all, the Lautenberg Amendment. There are immigrants who came here because of the Soviet Jewry movement and because of Frank Lautenberg, and their children are going to know that, and they're going to be grateful. I'm positive of it. He was a giant in transportation in the East. He improved the road. He oversaw the improvement of the trains, railroads in the East. There's a huge station in Secaucus named for him. And as you know, if you travel through New Jersey, that's a state that honors its transportation heroes.
Yes.
They like their turnpikes and their highways in New Jersey. So those two things I think are going to be, at least those two things are going to be major parts of his legacy.
You are always a joy to talk to. I always learn from you, Ron, and I appreciate your taking time to be with us on Shalom TV.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Be well. Those were the thoughts, recollections, analysis of Ron Kampeas, Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Again, what moved me always about Frank Lautenberg was the extent to which a United States Senator would be so absolutely, visibly present as an American Jew, and I give him enormous credit for that. By the way, he was just awarded Hillel's Renaissance Award for 2013, Renaissance Award, and he was too ill to attend the evening's event where that award was given to him, and his wife Bonnie came and took the award for Frank, and obviously people who knew him really understood how ill he was, and we mourn his passing. Our condolences, profound condolences, go to Bonnie. They had 6 children, 13 grandchildren, Mazal Tov. Frank Lautenberg's memory will be forever a blessing, Zecher Tzadik Livraka, and it's a real honor for us to be able to remember him here on Shalom TV. My thanks to Herbie Bolomovsky for assisting in this edition of In the News. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.